Well, welcome all to our Tech and Society Leadership in an Era of Rapid Change virtual gathering being hosted by UChicago's Master of Liberal Arts. And let me just virtually welcome you on behalf of the Graham School. On this afternoon, I'm especially grateful to say I'm the Dean of the Graham School here at the University of Chicago. And I am thrilled to welcome you virtually to our gorgeous campus. I will say it is this spectacular today. It is shining and it is dry and it is actually pretty cool. And so I know people are joining from all over. I see some Floridians and Californians. Today may be a day where we can compete here in Chicago. And I welcome you to this gorgeous environment because this is the ideas are born here that are going to be shaping a lot of our conversation. This gathering is being hosted by UChicago's Master of Liberal Arts, and I see many of our students, but I'll just share for those who are not familiar, it's an interdisciplinary graduate degree that helps leaders to really think about how to communicate, to write, and to critically look at big problems in the world through advanced studies in the liberal arts. And we are really excited that we have a new concentration in the degree that is called Tech and Society, and it is just what it sounds. It is an exploration of how technological advancements are reshaping our world and society, and really thinking deeply and critically about how we should manage that advancement toward the best outcomes for society. And we have a power team here to help us to think about these issues as we, with excitement, launch this new concentration. We're going to start in conversation with Daniel Moerner, who's an assistant professor here. We're then going to look at these in a very applied sense with an alum and trustee of the university, Kate Adams, who serves as senior vice president and general counsel at Apple. And then we're going to turn to two students, Cara and Bharat, who are in the Master of Liberal Arts currently and who are applying a lot of the ideas from the MLA in their own tech-oriented practices as they try to find the marriage of how they take these philosophical and intellectual ideas and bring them into their daily occupations and move forward technology in a way that is most consistent with their visions for how it can benefit society. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can add a spotlight on Daniel, who I'm going to have the joy of speaking with first in this conversation. And Daniel, you teach a course in the MLA on ethics in the digital age, where you step back and reflect on technological developments by bringing together the work of philosophers, historians, anthropologists, and sociologists. I loved when we first talked, you described your goal as to really think about the norms that we should use to guide continued technological development. And so, I first thought, well, this is, 18th century philosophy here. These are these very modern technological advancements. And you thought, oh, why not think about norms over time and space and how they apply even in this new context? And so I'm hoping to start our conversation by thinking with you about the, so to speak, why, how, and what of applying philosophy to technological advancement. And to get us started, I'm curious if you could start with the why and why you think it's important to examine technological advancement from a philosophical as well as a historic, anthropological, and sociological perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Seth. I guess I want to begin by saying that, it was wonderful to teach in the residential seminar for the first time last spring. I was just telling Seth, it was one of the best teaching experiences I've had at UChicago. And I think that this new concentration is really, urgent and exciting. And so I'm glad that it's coming to fruition finally. So you asked me, Seth, is what does interdisciplinarity bring to the study of technology? And in particular, what does philosophy add? And honestly, people often don't ask that question. People take interdisciplinarity for granted. And so I think it's good to take it seriously and try to think, what are we doing here? So I want to start with an idea that's really influenced me, which is that back in the 80s, Langdon Winner said that technology has a politics. And when he said that, he didn't mean that it's the politics of left and right. Instead, it's what he calls a politics of expediency and pragmatics. So, it's great that the hippies over there are worried about the environment, but that's no way to run a company. Or it's all well and good to worry about algorithms and advertising and monetization and their effects on social media, but we can't be profitable without them. I think that part of what an interdisciplinary approach shows us is it gives us a more holistic picture of technological advancement. Although progress in technology might be inevitable, the way that progress actually affects people, its forms are not inevitable. It's always the matter of concrete, struggle and political on a personal level. And I think that philosophy in particular really helps us understand this, because it gives us some of the conceptual resources to answer and think about questions like, how should we act? Who is responsible when a machine does something? What is it even to be a human in this world of technological change? So just to say one more thing about that last question, what is it to be a human? I think this is a really interesting and deep question. And it's one, oftentimes I think people view our humanity as challenged by technology. It puts us, it perhaps humbles us in a scary way in the face of technological development. But I don't think that has to be the way to think about it. Oftentimes, the very nature of a human being is to use tools, is to extend our cognition, extend our powers through the use of technology, through integrating ourselves with our environment. In fact, some philosophers think that it's sort of parochial to even draw a contrast between a human being and the tools that they use. They think that we should think of these as continuous integrated parts of a whole. That might just sound like jargon for now, but I think it has really concrete impacts for how we think about things like human rights, how we think about how we should treat people, how we should think about people's claims on welfare. If a human being is transformed by its relationship to its environment, if it's transformed by its use of the internet and the kinds of new questions it can ask by using Google or search engine, et cetera, human rights are no longer a static concept either. Our understanding of what rights individual people have must also adjust and adapt itself as people adjust and adapt themselves to new technologies. And so I think these are some of the questions that you obviously need an interdisciplinary approach to handle, because it touches on every aspect of our humanity and our relation to our environment.
So I think everything you described, people would find very compelling. I mean, in the sense that everyone sees that technology is disrupting our world, that there are, benefits and costs, and that these exist in a very moral landscape. At the same time, to your earlier point about the politics of technology, right? It's very hard to figure out how to navigate this uncertainty on a moral level when there are all these very straightforward kind of tactical things in front of us, right? So how many users, how much are people buying into this product? How is this getting traction and getting visibility? And so I'm curious if we could take the next step in this. So if we do buy into the idea that we want to apply some of this philosophical and normative thinking to this very important technology and advancement in society, right? I'm curious if you could take us to that level. Like, how in your class do you actually think about applying these philosophies that have existed for a long time in this very current climate, and maybe even bring us into a case study or two?
Yeah, so I think, nothing is static here. Philosophy of technology, digital ethics, these are all growing, exciting young fields. And so that means that, what we're doing is always going to be exploring in a productive way the relations between stodgy old theories that maybe aren't so stodgy anymore and new technological developments. And so, I could just, this is what the whole class is about. So, as you said, I'll just focus on a few examples. I'll start by taking your question seriously and going all the way back to the ancient Greeks. Plato, the ancient Greek philosopher, wrote the Republic in these many great works. I think that Plato is an incredibly helpful thinker to think about social media and the dynamics that are involved in social media. This is actually something we didn't really explore so much in the version of the class that I taught previously, but something I hope to integrate more in the future. Basically, I think it's the case that many social interactions on social media are motivated by imitation of others and placing oneself in the imaginary position of feeling oneself judged by one's peers. such that, for example, you feel compelled to criticize someone who you've never even met for some behavior that they did, because you feel that if you don't criticize them, someone will criticize you for it. These kinds of dynamics where we live in our own imaginary worlds, responding to the sort of perceived interactions with others and trying to imitate what we think others are doing as a model, is exactly the world of the Republic that Plato wants us to give us the resources to think beyond. Plato wants to show how a deeper understanding of what the good is, a deeper understanding of how we should interact with each other, can allow us to move beyond this sort of surface level engagement and into a more fundamental cooperative mode of acting. So, I mean, I find even someone writing 2,000 years ago helpful for thinking about social media.
And if I can ask the follow-up on that Plato example, what does it say to you as we think about the social media landscape? I mean, I think that many people, to your point, see what's happened with social media almost as an acceleration of existing human tendencies, but at a rate that has now caused certain challenges. So being the dad of, two girls, there's a lot of data that, there was already certain tendencies to kind of see imagery or, have a certain reaction from a relational standpoint. Now that I'm seeing those images constantly and I'm seeing only the best versions or the highest moments of people's selves, and I'm having to compare to that imitation, it can be very overwhelming, right, for my psyche. Do you find in that work ideas or constructive ways that we might think about how to navigate this new landscape?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about a lot of the ways that people have historically thought about ethical dilemmas, they take a concrete case and they say, should you do this or should you not? Thumbs up, thumbs down. It's quite simple. What's so interesting about new technology is that it adds an additional dimension to that, which is that there's a distinction between something being easy or having a low barrier to entry and something being more difficult. And it's amazing. I mean, of course, this distinction between things having a low barrier to entry and having a high barrier to entry has always been around us, but somehow technology makes it particularly salient. I mean, to give an example, in the EU and in some other parts of the world, there's these so-called right to be forgotten laws, which give you the right to request Google remove information from the personal information from you about their search index if it's no longer relevant. The right to be forgotten is not a right to have this information deleted off the internet. It's a right to make it harder to find by making it no longer be indexed in Google. And so this idea that we might have rights that sort of slow the world down, whether that's making it easy to find personal information about someone on Google, or whether that's stopping this sort of firestorm of social media from exploding so quickly, I think that's a fascinating topic in ethics. And I absolutely think that philosophers, especially philosophers from the so-called consequentialist tradition, who analyze ethical theories based upon comparing the predicted outcomes for the most number of people, I think they have a lot of resources to explain why speed can be relevant here, and can be ethically relevant.
And I'll ask one final question, and then we're going to go on to talk to a leader at one of the most important and consequential tech-driven firms in our world. Can you just talk about any other examples you've seen where you're watching the application of ethical norms to positively shape technology? I mean, building on the example you just gave from Europe.
I mean, you're asking me, has philosophy changed the world? And I don't know if I can say that. But here's what I can say. I mean, philosophers are never going to give us the text of a law and say, pass this and you're a good person. That's just not what we're doing. We're providing resources, we're providing principles that you can use to judge about whether or not behavior should be promoted or should be censured. We give motivations for people. And I think you can see that philosophical impact play out all across the spectrum. Sometimes it's very concrete. I mean, I think of this in cryptocurrency, for example. I mean, I feel like many people who are interested or disinterested in things like Bitcoin have that motivated for very philosophical reasons, whether it's one way or the other. But let me give us some more examples. I'll put in a plug, I guess, for one of my students from the spring. So one of the students who took my course, the residential seminar in the spring, Jonathan Baskin, he is working on developing what he calls cyber consequentialism, which is designed to be a framework for AI developers to use to try to integrate ethical reasoning into their development. And so he's put together a webpage called, I think it's called spiritualtelegraph.com, with white papers, short essays, consulting opportunities, of course, to try to show people how to integrate consequentialist reasoning about, and which includes sophisticated reasoning about how to make predictions about possible outcomes, how to compare different outcomes to each other, and how to bring that into AI development. And thinking about when you're designing training models, when you're thinking about weights in an AI, how you might be responsive to that.
Well,
and I guess, sorry, Seth, if you wanted to say something.
Go ahead.
I guess I want to say, I also would want to flip the question around. I mean, to me, it's just as interesting to ask, what can philosophy bring to technology, as to ask, what can technology bring to philosophy? What can technology bring to the liberal arts? And I mean, I just want to emphasize, I think it can bring a lot. I mean, many people worry about social media. I've already mentioned social media before, but it also provides wonderful opportunities for political coordination, for people to come together and to make things salient ethically that were never salient before. Something like the Free Britney movement, a TikTok movement to try to help Britney Spears, who is under the conservatorship of her father. That to me is, an ethical and political movement that was enabled by technology. And it's the flip side, I think, of your question, to have those kinds of opportunities.
Well, one of the things that I love about being at the University of Chicago is that we see these connections across time and space. And Daniel, you're a wonderful example to go from, Plato to the Free Britney movement, and to actually be able to draw a strand across them that is very clear in terms of the moral implications and the rationale and how technology is part of it. We're going to come back to you. So for those who have questions, we're going to come to questions at the end of all of our discussions. Thank you, Daniel, for now. And I want to bring on now Kate Adams, who is the SVP and General Counsel for Apple, reporting directly to CEO Tim Cook, and who previously served at Honeywell and was an executive there overseeing legal strategy across more than 100 countries. Importantly, she earned a bachelor's in comparative literature, which we'll come back to a little later in the discussion, as well as a law degree from here at the University of Chicago. And so, Kate, you've just heard Daniel describe how norms can shape technological advancement. And indeed, I think of Apple and its leadership as a clear case study, because you've put very clear values into action, especially around data and privacy, that have influenced the entire industry. And so I'm curious if we could talk a little bit about the why side of that first, and why Apple values privacy to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, first of all, Seth, thank you for having me. And it is really a pleasure to be here in an intellectual conversation, a little bit out of the rough and tumble of daily life and business, and makes me feel like I'm back in the front row. Adams is my last name, so a lot of times we were seated in alphabetical order, which stuck me in the very top, in the very front of the room. So now I feel like I'm getting called on a little bit, which is great. I'm boy, I'd kind of like to take Daniel's class, actually, but so anyway, it's wonderful to be here. And yes, I'd love to give some thoughts on our thinking about privacy, but I think it connects to a really interesting inflection point in human development or technology development, as it intersects with some of the points Daniel was making about what are we as humans, and how does technology intersect with that? One of the ways as a company we have thought about that is, what are the values? And again, we're just a company. We're not philosophers. We're not religious figures. We are doing this as practitioners of the technology arts, if you will, but still striving to bring principles to that work that bound it, or directed or guided in certain directions and not in other directions. And I think, I just make the point that we're not alone in doing this. There are really interesting things happening right now across the technology sector, of different groups working in different ways on how to think about these challenges. And so I think that I can give our example, but I think it's really actually reflected across a lot of organizations. But privacy is a value that we believe helps protect certain aspects or important aspects of our social environment. And one of them is to protect the individual. Another is to protect discourse and freedom for civic engagement, which then we view as essential to a functioning representative government, call it a democracy. And so privacy has ended up being a very valuable tool, if you will, or a valuable principle, because it actually has a lot of tentacles in different parts of what we think are important. So for example, your privacy, if you're a dissident in a repressive regime, protecting one's privacy, let's just say through the use of encryption in some sort of a communication service, is a way to protect that discourse. So that's an example of privacy in action. Similarly, and Daniel talked about the right to be forgotten, the right to have control over your personal information or information about you, gives you the right to self-determination over what the world knows about you and what communications you might get, or what you might how you might be targeted for commercial gain and so forth. And so that that's kind of sort of some of the backdrop to why privacy is so important, because I think it's a bit of it could seem like maybe a bit diminutive word, but it really encompasses much more than just the term privacy would suggest at a kind of basic level.
Right. Well, and it explains how a company that really started with a technological vision, right? It was going to make computing much more easy, much more personalized. It was going to give this interface. It was going to create this acceleration in our ability to interact. Right now, suddenly is intertwined with human rights and the ability of a dissident to be able to express themselves, and the ability of someone to be able to go beyond maybe a past record, or just a past embarrassment, even in today's society. And you've already described some of the ways that you're operationalizing. I'm curious to dig into the kind of culture and context in which decisions take place, because something that came up in our preparatory conversation that I thought was fascinating, being here at the University of Chicago especially, is that you described that there was this open exchange or even debate culture that animated Apple at its leadership, and that you're looking at these big questions, right? And no one knows the answers to these questions, even when you're sitting inside of one of the companies that has pioneered this whole world of technology. And so I'm curious if you could just talk a little bit about, there are all these big questions and contestations around human rights, and we think of that very naturally here at the university. But even at Apple and other technology firms, these are the same conversations and debates happening. Obviously, different contexts, but in some ways similar structure to people making arguments and trying to imagine the possibilities. And so, yeah, let me just ask you what that looks like at Apple in particular.
Yeah, and I think it's such a wonderful kind of comparison, really, to the university. I'm going to say that I believe this happens in many places, but I obviously can speak to the context of our work. And it, when you're confronted with the immense power that a technology or products, it's that combination of things, it's products, it's services, it's the core technology that makes those things work, it has the power for good or ill, right? And there's that great saying, knowledge without goodness is evil, goodness without knowledge is weak. There's a responsibility when you have the ability to harness these powerful tools, to do so in a spirit of robust debate and contestation, as you use the word. I love that word. And so we have, in terms of moving things forward, we always start with the why and what is it that we're trying to do, and should we try to do that?
Yeah.
And that is and that debate is happening at the inception point, not after the fact. And I think that's an important quality of great decision making in general, is that these philosophical questions, if we want to use that term, are part of the foundation of creating the new tool, or developing and launching a new tool, or whatever, the thing that you're giving to the world. So, because as time goes forward, you're going to be confronted with a myriad of challenges that you can't necessarily, well, you won't be able to predict them. By definition, they're not all predictable. And you need that debate and alignment around the reasons to guide you in the future as this thing that you put into the world morphs, and it is used in ways that you didn't anticipate, or it is challenged in ways that you didn't anticipate. And so, but we live like we're in a Socratic classroom. I mean, it is constant dialogue, and it doesn't end just because a product is in the world. It comes back. Well, what did we talk about? Why did we do it this way? Well, why didn't we do it this other way? Well, because the principle that we wanted to protect was X, Y, or Z. We see now a challenge to that is that do we reconfirm that that's the principle? And then how do we respond to that today, using those North Stars? And so I have to say, it's like a continuation of my education at the law school, but it is, I think, a very important conversation for any entity or any person that holds some measure of power over, a thing that they're going to put into the world, be it AIM, a large language model is a great example of something that's happening right now, led by other companies and Apple, with GPT chat and all those new offerings.
Well, and picking up on that, Kate, and this is the final question I want to ask you now, and then we'll welcome audience questions. This is a world that is only going to become more disrupted and innovative. I mean, ChatGPT, the rise of artificial intelligence, is further accelerating the pace of change. And alongside that, what we believe here at the university is that the liberal arts has never been more essential. And that's because in a world where there's artificial intelligence, what really distinguishes the humans is the critical thinking, the ability to be inventive and creative beyond what's been done before. And I notice in your background, comparative literature, which one would think might be very far from the worlds of Apple and futuristic technologies. But I know you've talked about how that was foundational and remains so to your ability to engage in these future-oriented questions and to see possibilities that may not be obvious on immediate technical grounds. And so I'm curious if you could just talk about, especially in this moment of dynamism, how has a liberal arts education really shaped your ability to lead and think imaginatively about the possibilities?
Yeah, it's such an interesting kind of sort of sea change, really, in some of generally the thinking about what education should be in a time where we are confronted with very important moral and ethical questions that don't have simple answers.
Right.
And the machine doesn't answer the question. And so what tools do you have to be able to think about, let's just take large language models. That's a good one, because that's something that the whole industry is thinking about. I imagine the audience is somewhat familiar with this, but these are incredibly powerful tools, and it poses the question: what should humans be doing and machines be doing? How do we protect these machines from doing evil things, which they're fully capable of doing, and what is the responsibility of the creator in that, in that context, and all of those sort of, almost literary questions, if you will, the kind of things that are embodied in great literature, great poetry, great drama, are actually extremely relevant to, the questions that we think about now. And I don't mean that, necessarily you look to Shakespeare for an answer per se, but you could look to Shakespeare for the dilemma.
Yeah.
And I think that that holistic, boundary-less thinking is what's needed here, and highly, highly sought after. Interestingly, I mean, there's a lot of interest now in hiring liberal arts majors, because they can read and analyze, they can think deeply, they can question, and maybe, really importantly, they can write, which it's hard to graduate with a degree in the liberal arts without learning strong writing skills. And those with coding being a new form of communication, that's actually kind of becoming a bit of a lost art. But it's also essential when you're trying to deeply analyze complicated subjects. You need to have the ability to articulate the questions in a clear, analytical way that doesn't oversimplify either. And so that that interdisciplinary, multivariate thinking that you learn in the liberal arts programs is really valuable. I use it all the time. I mean, I think that's probably spend more of my time thinking that way than probably, as a technical expert, if you will, as a technical lawyer.
Well, Kate, thank you. We're going to come back to you in a little bit when we come to Q&A, but it's been fascinating to take a glimpse into how Apple and how you individually, as a liberal arts grad, are looking at these issues at the futuristic stage of the world. And I'm now going to move us into a conversation with two of our current MLA students who are also leaders in technology and tech-adjacent firms. And so, Cara, I imagine you related to that idea of being at the front of the room when things are alphabetized. Cara Allamano is the Chief People Officer at Lattice, which itself is an award-winning people management platform. And Bharat Chandran is a senior technology leader and program head at Wipro, where he focuses on delivering technology-enabled IT transformation solutions to clients globally. And neither of you are strangers to technology before joining the Master of Liberal Arts program. So I'm curious if each of you could share how your graduate education in the liberal arts so far has shaped the way that you've looked at technology, knowing you've been part of technology for a long time, but now you're getting new lenses to look at it. And so, Cara, can we start with you?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. A lot of what Kate was sharing really resonated with me as well. And to give some just really specific examples, so much of what I do in my day-to-day is not just thinking about business strategy and tying talent management to business strategy. It's also putting myself in the position of the full range of employees and customers that we have. And in order to do that, it's really about being deeply empathetic and being able to think like an engineer and think like a program manager and think like a salesperson, to in some ways be able to incorporate that perspective in the conversations that I'm having at executive level, that I'm having at board level, and really helping us harness the talent, which I believe is the lever of the engine of our success, no matter what company that I'm at. And the benefit of being in technology companies is so much of what we do is about creativity and innovation, that it's a really easy case to be made that the individual and their perspectives is what is our differentiating factor. So tie that pretty quickly back to what we do in MLA classes, which is really put the hat on of the different thinkers that we're exploring. As Kate said, having dynamic conversations in the classroom and learning the perspectives of the full range of folks that are also students and are professors. And what's been really helpful to me is we can live in a bubble in technology. And to be a part of a program where I'm sitting next to in a virtual environment when I haven't done, I've actually been on campus and done some residence and done a residential, and I've also had courses where we're in a remote environment. And when you're having people from China and Chicago and London talking and having different perspectives, I think that's really important.
Well, thank you, Cara. And Bharat, how would you answer that same question?
Yeah, sure. Seth, thank you. First of all, thank you for having me. And as you mentioned, right, my role is to deliver large IT programs. But what it really means is that I'm supposed to be the hammer when it comes to technology, right? And everything around me are like nails, right? I mean, that's the kind of situation that we are in, where technology is really looked at to solve many of the problems enterprise-wide, right? And what liberal arts kind of a program, as Cara and Kate said, right, the liberal arts program brings in that thought process and that mindset, right? That shift in mindset to explore the fresh perspectives, right? So if you allow me, I will take a simple example. I heard Kate mentioning about the chatbot, right? So I was thinking maybe I'll take that as an example. And in an enterprise, this chatbot is typically supposed to resolve issues, right? And when you have issues, you go to the chatbot and then, ask for help. So let's say that there are 10,000 plus chat initiations that happens in a month, right? The objective of an automation engineer or a bot is to reduce the tickets that get transferred to a live agent, right? And his objective is that, okay, let's harness the maximum issues using a bot so that I reduce the manual efforts that needs to be done by an agent, right? But then, the automation engineer can also think that, okay, when I increase this effectiveness of the bot, they can feel happy and excited about it, right? Where, oh, great that I reduced 50% of the volume, or 100% of the, or 100% is probably not possible, but at least 80% of it, right? Then if you really put a liberal arts perspective to it, the question to ask could be, is it okay to have 10,000 issues, right?
Right.
How can we eliminate these issues, right? So the question is not about resolving the issues, rather flipping it and saying that, how do we really look at elimination as a topic, right? It is about bringing the cultural change in the automation team, saying, before you look at automating something, can you look at the potential of eliminating such an issue? So coming back, I mean, this seeing the big picture, right? I mean, solving a broader problem, I would say, thinking outside the box in a way, and reframing this problem by itself, and consciously trying to be out of the silo. When you are into a technology mindset, when you are into a technology program, it's so usual that you get into this mindset that technology can solve, and let's first do that, right? So taking a step back and doing this reflection, I believe, is something a liberal arts program study can definitely equip you with.
Well, can I use that as a bridge back to you, Cara? Because that's a very specific example, Bharat, of how you're seeing this very intellectual engagement at the university actually shape the way that you're applying solutions in your work. And I'm curious, Cara, if you can speak to an example in your world, and maybe we'll come back, Bharat, for another one from you, of how the changing perspective and the intellectual engagement is actually shaping direct applications at your workplace. And so, yeah, Cara, let me turn that back.
Yeah, I'm super happy to chat about this. And I think for better or for worse, I have a lot of examples from the past few years, one of which was COVID. And within a day, the entire world changed, and the assumptions that we made about work changed pretty immediately. And the good news is we had technology which could facilitate that transition to remote first workforce and different types of environments that people can work in. But fundamentally, none of the recent for me, none of the recent frameworks that you can open up any of these business books behind me and see was going to help me help my leadership and the rest of the organization navigate through how do we manage a pandemic. But also interestingly, there's plenty of historical perspectives on pandemics. I was in the middle of a class learning about Marcus Aurelius, and he had the pleasure of working through a plague environment. And it really resonated with me because I was able to take some of his Stoic perspectives and bring that to the table. Because what's interesting in technology and in technology leadership is we're used to, moving fast, breaking things, and then figuring it out and picking up and moving on. In an environment where there's so much change for so many people across the board, inside, personally, professionally, that was not the right perspective to take, because the companies that made a lot of immediate decisions or broad strokes announcbecents around how they were going to treat remote work, what their perspective was going to be, they ended up rolling them back. Everything appeared to be very hyper reactive, and then you're losing trust at that level. So a lot of our discussions, I was at Udemy at the time, we were ramping to become a public company. There was a lot of heads down work that was being done. A lot of our discussions were framed around the Stoic mindset of patience, fortitude, all of us working together to support each other, but being thoughtful and considered through this process. And that really resonated with our organization. It maintained the trust that we had, and it showed that we were really intentionally thoughtfully leading through this. And the outcome was pretty good for the company. We did go public, and we had very high levels of retention and employee engagement during that time period.
All right, I want a final word from you, then we're going to bring everyone back for Q&A. Are there examples that come to mind beyond the one that you shared for the chatbot? And can I ask an addendum question in your case? Because you are in client services, and so I'm curious, as you bring these solutions and people are seeing you as the hammer potentially, how do clients think about these more imaginative possibilities as you've engaged them?
Yeah, sure, Seth. See, as Cara said, right, I think there are numerous avenues and areas and examples that we can think about. But I will take the latest one, which Kate said earlier, which is about the Gen AI thing, right? So while Gen AI opens up this new set of capabilities and enablers in the business and organizations as such, the questions to ask would be, where can we use this Gen AI, right? And where shouldn't it be, right? So in terms of the client question that you specifically asked, can the proprietary client info be used to train a bot or any Gen AI, right? Can the customer information be used to train a Gen AI? Can we share the personal info to train a Gen AI? Because Gen AI is extremely capable to generate the data set, right? Whether it's a text or an image or a 3D model or audio or a video or so on and so forth. So coming back to the key point, I think the building such kind of digital solutions, when we engage with customer, right, what we start with is fundamentally listening to them really, right? And as Daniel said earlier, it is about these fusion teams, right? Building these fusion teams across multiple areas, right? Where marketing team can bring in a sentimental analysis, right? But finance team might be looking at this digital tool to say, how can I increase my profit or a growth, right? So from a client perspective, when we go to the board or like an executive level, each leaders bring in their own ask to this digital mindset. But for us as leaders, what we need to do or what we are trying to do is creating these stories, right? Like building these digital dividends, defining them much early. And as Kate said, it's the question of, should we be using Gen AI? before jumping in and saying, how can we build a Gen AI, right? So those are the questions. And I would say the need of the hour in a way is for the technologists, so to speak, to move away from a just pure play technologist role to more into a social or corporate citizen, so to speak.
Well, so I'm going to bring back Kate and Daniel now, and we are going to have a full discussion. And I already see a number of questions in our chat. So let me just have them come back on our virtual screen here. And I'll get started with the first question from Daniel O'Neill, which is whether AI is changing the legal and social perspective for corporate social responsibility. Should companies be responsible for the economic, social, or political externalities? And let me start this on a philosophical lens and bring this to you, Daniel, because I think what that question is really getting at in my mind is how do you think from a philosophical perspective about knock-on effects or even unintended consequences? And this is increasingly real in technology because you create a technology, you can't even imagine all the uses. And inevitably, even amidst maybe many good uses, there may be negative ones, right? So someone using that social media platform just spread lies or to, spread something that may have harm from a health perspective, or, you can imagine. How do you think philosophically about the ownership or implications or moral, perspective on those issues when, again, intent is a big theme, but in some cases it may not have even been intended because, these possibilities couldn't have been imagined when you were developing the technology.
Yeah, so I don't think that intentions are things that we get to just make up and declare. Intentions are embedded in our actions and can be revealed in the actions we take, no matter what we might say about them. And so someone can't say, oh, I didn't mean to kill that person. I just happened to know that the gun was in my hand and I just meant to move my finger. You don't get that, you don't get to get away with that, as the lawyers would agree. And so I think, when we think about what's going on here, we want to think about testing the actions, think about what would someone do in a similar case? Would they still pursue the same kind of development? Would they have restricted it in some way? And these kinds of things let us say that even if someone doesn't outwardly intend to do something, intentions might nonetheless be embedded in what they are doing. In the concrete case of AI and social responsibility, I think that when you're developing new technology, although there's no obligation to consider every possible consequence of what you do, there has to be some responsibility for at least some reasonably foreseen set of consequences, many of which you likely did intend, even if you publicly deny it.
Very interesting. And I assume that has all sorts of implications in terms of, the possibilities of copyright infringement, the possibilities of taking people's identities, all those things which I think could be reasonably foreseen as you imagine a machine that's going to use patterns to then, create new ideas and bring data into the world. Kate, Karen, Bharat, can we open that up to you? Maybe Kate first, just a little bit about how Apple may see this in a world where, there's such a dramatic evolution in the possibilities of technology.
Yeah, well, I think maybe, I think you've stated it, which is we are in a time, of immense change and also a very, complex set of new tools that are available to do a lot of different things. And so, as I think it's clear that any entity using these tools has the obligation that Daniel postulated, which is to responsibly think about consequences. And I agree that, look, there are things that are, the unknown unknowns and all that stuff. But there is and as lawyers, we all know, this concept of the reasonably foreseeable. And that's probably a good benchmark to begin with, also because it has some legal bounding to it, and the law of negligence. So, but all of us working in this space need to be clear with what is it that we're using these things for? How are they built? So that's really important. These large language models in particular are using data from all sorts of places that may or may not be actually legally available for that use. It may also be personal data to people who have not consented to have their information shared. And so there's an enormous responsibility to understand what is going into the model, because that's going to come out of the model at some point in some form. So and then there's also how are you deploying this? What is the purpose that you are using it for? And obviously, as we know, because anybody who's played with these things can see, you can get it to write a hateful screed if you work at it enough. So anticipating the potential uses, not just by yourself, but if you're unleashing it into the world by others, and bringing intentionality to that, either to reining it in or being honest, at least with yourself, about what you're creating as an opportunity.
Cara and Bharat, before we move on, anything to add to those comments as you think about your context?
I think they did a great job. I don't know that I would add much more.
So we have go for it, Bharat.
No, I just want to just add to what Kate said, right? But bringing that awareness from a programmer or a developer level to the stakeholder or a leader in the organization, that spectrum of people who needs to be aware of what this is going to do is going to be super critical. Yeah.
We have another question in the chat. It's from Hector Rivera. When discussing technology and its influence on the human, do the writings of Martin Heidegger on technology have anything to say to 21st century technocrats? If left unchecked, can technology distort our sense of being in the world? I think this also gets to a broader theme that was in a number of the comments around, what does it mean to be human in a world of artificial intelligence? And how do we think about that philosophically? What does that mean? And how do we implicate that in practice? I mean, Daniel, you're just the natural person to start with, because it all starts with a philosophical nature, and then we get into, from theory to practice. So do you know, I'm sure you do, at least at a high level, the work of Heidegger, and how would you answer that question to start with?
Well, yeah, you could teach a whole class on this topic. I'll just be brief. I mean, Heidegger, when he's talking about technology, he doesn't use it in the same sense in which, it's in the title of, our webinar today. One of the examples that Heidegger gives, I think this is from the 1950s, is between two different ways that you could make a cabinet. You could make a cabinet by taking a bunch of wood and throwing away all the pieces that aren't straight and tossing them. Or you could make a cabinet by taking a bunch of wood and then designing your cabinet in a way that reflects the complexities of the wood, that tries to work around instead of cutting out the eyes in the wood, etc. And so, I associate Heidegger's view with, trying to defend the value of that second practice. Not to say that there aren't some times when we need to throw things away, but to think, can we, adjust our ways of living in order to be more accommodating of nature? And so you can see how this has absolutely had a tremendous impact on, conservation movements, on indigenous movements, on people who are really focused on, I think, a laudable goal of thinking about, well, how can we shape our goals to what's available to us, instead of always trying to shape the world to what our goals are.
Kate, can we come over to you with that question, obviously, in a practical sense? And, how do you see those questions of technology distortion and, how we think about the human in this very changing environment of intelligence?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's fundamental to the inquiry, in that really, I think maybe everything that you're thinking about when you're trying to understand how these emerging tools work, and also how they might be deployed, this does come back to humanity in some form or another, right? I mean, and what do we aspire to be as humankind, and then what should we be? I mean, look, Daniel's the philosopher, so he can decide what kind of grammar to use. But it's just integral to the inquiry, right? I mean, for example, and this is one that's gotten a lot of discussion. A chat, one of these tools can write music, It can, is that still art? And if it can write a really great song, well, what's the role of human creativity then? Okay, if it can, now there's other, obviously, I think there's so many gradations. I think art is maybe one of the most challenging, because it kind of really deeply poses the question, is art the individual creativity of a person, or is it something else that we never really thought it was? I don't know the answer to that, of course. But, and then you get into areas where it's a lot more, I think, much more benign or less complicated. So for, in my world, for example, I'm really interested in seeing if we can use some of these tools to simplify the process of discovery and legal proceedings, which is very time consuming, expensive, painful for all involved. Now, of course, even that has some consequences, because it might change the way work is allocated. And we need to think about that, right? Does that, it's a legitimately a question that we should think about before we just embrace this new way of doing it. But you can see that there's a huge range of potential questions that implicate our humanity in so many ways, and they deserve to be pondered before we take the step of making something available or using it.
Well, we are coming to the end of our time, but I want to have a power round finish. And one of the beliefs of the UChicago Master of Liberal Arts is that we have our greatest outcome really helping people to think more critically and to ask better questions. And so I want to end, actually, very appropriate to the uncertainty that we face as we look to the future, even as we try to apply moral and philosophical logic, with a question for you, which is, what is the biggest question that you have as you look to the future of tech and society? So if you had to say, like, what's the big question on your mind that you're eager to investigate in the years ahead, where you don't have, an immediate answer? And, Daniel, maybe we'll start with you, since I feel like philosophers are just always asking questions and posing them to us, and, frustrating our lives with these big questions. What question do you want to start with, and then we'll come to the rest of the group?
I mean, this is a huge topic, but I mean, I guess I'll be selfish and express what I'm personally interested in, which is, we didn't end up coming to it, but it was raised by a number of people in the Q&A, but I'm very interested in the future of intellectual property and the intersection with AI. I mean, I think there's a lot of open questions about how we'll think about intellectual property, how we'll think about the human contribution, and how we'll think about protections for it. And I just think it's a really open question.
Kate, can we come to you next?
Sure. I mean, there's a bunch of really interesting things in my world that are more tactical, if you will, and very important. But I think that I come back to the question, where do the human and the machine intersect, if at all? Like, where is that line to be found? Or is there a line? I don't know. I mean, to me, in the bigger picture, that is a really important technical, philosophical question, because it goes to what does it mean to be human when you can replicate a lot of what being human is with a machine? What's still on the other side of the ledger? And that's not going to get answered, I don't think, probably not in my lifetime, but still, I think something we should constantly be asking.
Cara?
My company is Lattice, and our mission is to make work meaningful. And we do that by creating an operating system for employees and managers, and hopefully getting rid of some of the trivial things and highlighting the things that really bring value and meaning to work. So that's what I think about a lot. I think about the tools that we build, and this is where we spend most of our time. So how do we make it meaningful, leveraging technology?
All right, you have our final question.
Yeah, so when I think about my customers, and in my work, that's what we do, right? We think about customers and engage with them. And the key point that bothers us a lot is this influence of GenAI now, and how do we protect the customer data? How do we make sure that there are no copyright issues or IP issues? Or How do we bring in the intelligence to avoid any bias into the data or compliance related to data issues? So those are the questions that we ponder on.
Well, this has been an amazing discussion and very true to form for the interdisciplinarity and people coming from multiple lived experience to really think about these issues together. Thank you all for being part of our launch of the Tech and Society concentration, which will formally begin on September 26th. And I think at the least, we've laid out a number of big picture questions that validate why we've decided to make a concentration so that we at the university can be part of investigating these issues and hopefully ensuring that the philosophies that are taught across the university are deeply considered as advancement continues. Have a good afternoon, everyone, and thanks again to our outstanding discussants. Bye, everyone.